Rain doesn't fall in Millhaven, Montana. It arrives. It comes in low and heavy off the Rockies, pressing down on the town like a hand on a shoulder, like something that has been waiting all day to finally make its presence known. The streets go dark before the sun is fully gone. The neon signs bleed color into the wet asphalt. The mountains disappear behind clouds so thick and black they look like the edge of something permanent. And in the parking lot of a converted auto repair shop 6 miles northeast of town, a single man stands in the downpour. He is 68 years old. He is not tall in the way that draws attention. He is built in the way that keeps it. Wide through the shoulders, narrow through the jaw, with a stillness in his posture that doesn't come from confidence alone. It comes from having been in enough bad situations to know that panic is just energy wasted on the wrong thing. His hands hang loose at his sides. Not threatening, not afraid, just ready. Behind him, the sign of the Steel Reapers Motorcycle Club flickers in the rain. Red, then dark, then red again. The parking lot holds 20 motorcycles, their chrome dulled by weather, their engines cold. Through the windows of the main building, shadows move. Big shadows, loud ones, the kind that travel in groups because they stopped trusting themselves alone a long time ago. The man in the rain doesn't move. Water runs down the lines of his face, tracing every year, every scar, every decision that brought him to this particular parking lot on this particular night. His eyes are the color of winter sky. Pale blue and clear, the eyes of a man who has seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it, but not enough of the good parts to stop believing they exist. His name is Roy Weston, and for the first time in 15 years, he is exactly where he was trained to be. His voice when it comes is quiet, barely louder than the rain. 48 hours, he says to no one. That's all it took. 48 hours to go from a man who made pizza for a living to a man standing in the dark outside the most dangerous address in 3 counties. 48 hours between ordinary and whatever this was. Between the life he had built carefully, deliberately, one Thursday at a time, and this moment in the rain, with the weight of everything pressing down. He exhales slowly. The breath mists in the cold air and disappears. Then the lights inside the building go out. Not all of them, but enough. A door opens. Light spills out and silhouettes fill the frame. Large men, angry men. Men who have spent their entire adult lives practicing the language of intimidation and have gotten very good at it. Roy Weston watches them come. He doesn't back up a single step. The screen goes dark, a heartbeat in the silence. Then we go back, 48 hours, to where it all began. To a Tuesday morning in Millhaven, Montana, where the sky was clear and cold and the mountains sat sharp against the blue, like they had been placed there with intention. To a man making pizza dough at 5 in the morning. Because that is where this story actually starts. Not in the rain, not in the parking lot, but in a small pizza shop on the corner of Main and Clifford, where a man with scarred hands and a country music radio station that hadn't updated its playlist since 1992 began his day the same way he had begun every day for the past 15 years, by keeping a promise to a woman who was no longer alive to hear it. The shop was called Weston's Corner. It had been there long enough that people in Millhaven had stopped thinking of it as a business and started thinking of it as part of the landscape the way they thought about the water tower or the grain elevator on Highway 12 or the Catholic Church on 4th Street. It simply existed. It had always existed. It would always exist. The sign in the window was hand-painted. The booths had been reupholstered twice. The oven was a commercial unit from 2003 that Roy had repaired himself so many times he could take it apart in the dark, and once had. The walls held photographs. Millhaven in the 1970s, when the grain cooperative was still running and Main Street was full on Saturday afternoons. A photograph of the high school football team from 1987 state champions, their faces young and grinning and unaware of everything coming. A photograph of the Millhaven Fire Department at their annual picnic dated 2008. Small histories, the kind that accumulate on the walls of places where people feel comfortable enough to leave them. And on the wall behind the counter, in a plain wooden frame, that Roy had made himself a photograph of a woman. She was laughing in the picture, her head thrown back, her eyes closed, caught in the middle of something that had made her forget entirely that a camera was pointed at her. She was beautiful in the way that has nothing to do with appearance, the kind of beautiful that comes from being genuinely, completely present in a moment. Her name had been Maggie Weston. She had been Roy's wife for 22 years and his reason for everything for longer than that. And she had been gone now for 15 years, taken by a cancer that spread through her body with the same quiet efficiency that Roy had once applied to everything he did in service of his country. She fought it without complaint, without self-pity, with a stubbornness that Roy had loved from the first day he met her and never stopped loving, not even when that stubbornness was the thing keeping her in a hospital bed instead of letting herself rest. She lasted 2 years after the diagnosis. At the end, she gave Roy a building she had inherited from her father, a savings account she had kept private, and a note written in her careful schoolteacher handwriting on a piece of yellow legal paper. The note said, "Make it a place where people feel safe, Roy. That's your next mission." He had read that note so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. He kept it in the small office at the back of the shop, tucked inside a book about Montana history that nobody had ever actually read. He opened the shop at 6 every morning. He made the dough himself by hand, the way Maggie had taught him in this same kitchen in the first year they were married, when neither of them knew what they were doing and neither of them cared. He sourced his vegetables from 2 farms outside of town. He grated his own cheese. He was not doing this for the money. He was doing it because she had asked him to, and because a man who has spent 20 years making promises in serious circumstances understands better than most what it means to keep one. Roy worked his hands through the dough at 5 in the morning while Merle Haggard played on a radio that had been tuned to the same station since 2009. His hands moved with the rhythm of long repetition, fold and press and turn, fold and press and turn, the motion as automatic as breathing, leaving his mind free to go where it needed to go. His hands told a story. Scars crossed his knuckles in thin white lines. A long scar ran from his left wrist toward his elbow, the remnant of a night in a country most people in Millhaven would never think about. Another scar disappeared under the rolled cuff of his sleeve climbing toward his shoulder, the memory of a decision made in a fraction of a second that had cost exactly what decisions made that fast tend to cost. These were not cooking scars. These were what you collect when young men with weapons are trying seriously to end your existence, and you refuse to cooperate. Roy Weston had been a Navy SEAL for 20 years. Senior Chief, the rank that sits just below the top of the enlisted structure, the rank of a man who has proven himself so thoroughly in so many different contexts, under so many different forms of pressure that the institution has decided to stop questioning his judgment and start trusting it completely. He had run operations in the Persian Gulf, in Kuwait, in Somalia, and Afghanistan, in places that appeared on no tourist map and would never appear in any official account of anything. He had made decisions that no training exercise could fully prepare you for, and he had lived with those decisions every day since, in the quiet way of men who understand that the past is not something you leave behind, but something you carry, and the only question is whether you carry it well. He had retired in 2008, 2 years before Maggie died. He had spent those 2 years learning to make pizza. She had thought that was the funniest thing she had ever heard. She had also thought it was exactly right. He didn't hear Amy come in the first time. That was the thing that stayed with him afterward. Roy Weston had spent 20 years being impossible to sneak up on. He had slept light enough to wake at the sound of a safety being disengaged 30 feet away. He had trained himself to notice everything, the angle of shadows, the rhythm of footsteps, the quality of silence that meant something was about to happen. But Amy Doyle had walked in the back door on a Monday morning in March with her bicycle locked up outside and her backpack over one shoulder, and Roy hadn't registered any of it until she said good morning. He had looked up from the dough. She was 22 years old. She had the kind of face that made strangers want to trust her, open and direct, freckled across the nose, in a way that looked like something from a painting of Irish countryside. Her hair was dark red, the color of autumn oak leaves pulled back in a ponytail she touched every 10 minutes without seeming to notice. Her eyes were green, not the pale green that fades in certain lights, but a deep, clear green that held its color regardless of what was happening around it. She wore blue scrubs under a winter coat that had a patch on the left elbow, stitched carefully in a thread that was almost but not quite the right shade of blue. The kind of repair you make yourself when replacing the coat is not something you are currently considering. "Good morning, Mr. Weston," she said. He had told her on her first day to call him Roy. He had told her again on her second, and her third. She kept forgetting or pretending to forget, and he had eventually stopped correcting her and accepted that some people show respect in ways you don't get to choose. She tied on her apron and went to work. Roy watched her the way he watched everything, with the automatic attention of 20 years of training. He noticed how she moved, quick and efficient, no wasted motion. The movement of someone who had learned early that time was not something you had in excess. He noticed the way she checked her phone every 40 minutes, not to scroll or distract herself, but to read a message, type something brief, and put it back in her pocket with a small expression of relief. He figured out who she was checking on within the first week. Tommy Doyle was 10 years old. He had a congenital heart defect, a malformed valve that had been identified at birth and monitored carefully for a decade with the understanding that eventually it would need to be corrected surgically. The surgery was not experimental. It had a high success rate and a recovery time that most pediatric cardiologists described as manageable. It cost $80,000. The Doyle family had $42,000 saved. Amy worked 3 jobs. She delivered pizzas for Weston's Corner during the day. She worked the night pharmacy counter at Millhaven Medical from 10 until 2 on Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. On weekends, she babysat for 2 families on the north side of town, families with young children who needed care, and didn't ask too many questions about why the girl watching their kids looked perpetually tired. Her mother, Patricia, cleaned houses. 4 houses a week, sometimes 5, the kind of work that pays in cash and costs in ways that don't show up in any accounting. Her father had died when Amy was 16. Life insurance had run out 2 years after that, around the same time Tommy's medical needs were becoming impossible to ignore, and the number 80,000 had begun appearing in every conversation the family had about the future. Amy kept a small notebook with a red cover. Roy had seen it once when it fell from her coat pocket, and she retrieved it quickly with the expression of someone reclaiming something private. He hadn't asked about it, but over the following weeks he had noticed the precision with which she counted her tip money at the end of each shift. She counted it twice, then a third time. Then she wrote something in the notebook. He understood what she was doing. She was running a number in her head every day, every shift, every dollar added to or subtracted from a figure that represented the distance between where she was and where Tommy needed her to be. Turning it into data because data felt like control and control felt like hope. Roy had started putting $40 in a plain envelope every Thursday. He kept the envelope in the back office in the drawer under his register. He added to it without ceremony, and he told himself it was a business decision, and he mostly believed it. Amy didn't know about the envelope. He intended to keep it that way until the amount in it mattered enough to say out loud. The relationship between Roy Weston and Amy Doyle built itself without either of them trying to build it. It built itself through repetition, through proximity, through small moments that don't seem like anything at the time and turn out to be everything later. It built when Roy fixed her bicycle without being asked, replacing the rear brake cable on a Tuesday afternoon and saying nothing about it except that the old one was about to go. It built when she brought him coffee one morning, exactly the way he drank it, black and strong, even though he had never once told her how he took it. It built through the way she talked to Tommy on the phone, the brightness she put in her voice that was genuine but also effortful, the brightness of someone who has decided that the person they love will not hear them worry. Roy heard the effort. He recognized it. It was the same effort he had made in phone calls from forward operating bases in countries with poor satellite coverage, the same calibration of voice and word designed to reassure someone far away that everything was fine when fine was not the most accurate description available. She didn't talk about her father much. Once on a slow Wednesday afternoon when the lunch orders were done and dinner prep hadn't started, she had been wiping down the counter with the energy of someone who needed to be doing something with their hands while they thought. She mentioned her father in a single sentence, something he used to say, then stopped herself mid-thought and changed the subject so smoothly that another person might not have noticed the change at all. Roy noticed. He didn't press. He had learned a long time ago that some silences are load-bearing. You push on them and things fall. The moment that mattered most happened on a Thursday afternoon in October, 3 weeks before the night that changed everything. Amy had been straightening the photographs on the wall, a task she did periodically, and without being asked, and she paused in front of the picture of Maggie. She studied it for a moment, the way you study something that interests you when you think no one is watching. She looks like someone who laughed a lot, Amy said. Roy's hands stilled in the dough. She was, he said, every single day. A moment passed between them. I'm sorry you lost that, Amy said. She said it simply without performance, the way you say true things to people when you have decided they can handle them. Roy looked across the kitchen at this 22-year-old girl with the patched coat and the red notebook, and the brother who needed surgery, and something in his chest tightened in a way he recognized and had not felt in a long time. I'm sorry you're carrying so much, kid, he said. Amy nodded once, then she finished straightening the photographs and went back to work. Roy thought about that exchange for the rest of the day. The way 2 people who don't know each other well can sometimes locate each other with perfect accuracy in the space of a single sentence. He thought about the daughter he and Maggie had never had. They had tried for years. It never happened. He had carried that absence quietly for a long time, a small grief inside a larger life. the kind that doesn't announce itself but shows up in unexpected moments. Looking at Amy, sometimes the absence felt less like loss and more like a door he hadn't known was still open. He didn't say any of this out loud. He was 68 years old and he had learned the difference between what you felt and what you said. October in Montana turns cold before you're ready for it. It comes without apology. One week the leaves are changing and the afternoons are still warm enough to eat outside. Then overnight the temperature drops 20 degrees, the mountains wear white, and the cold settles into the town like it owns the place, because in a meaningful sense it does. On the Thursday that changed everything, the cold arrived ahead of schedule. Roy opened the shop at 6 as always. 4 batches of dough sauce, prep cheese, grated vegetables sliced. The morning orders came in steady. The county planning office called in their usual combination. The construction crew on Highway 12 ordered lunch for 14, a few walk-in customers. The particular manageable rhythm of a small business in a small town. Amy came in at 8:30. She looked tired in the way that has a source, not the loose tiredness of poor sleep, but the directed tiredness of someone who had been awake for something specific. Roy noticed it and said nothing. The afternoon moved slowly. Johnny Cash gave way to Waylon Jennings on the radio. The light through the front windows went from sharp to flat as clouds moved in off the mountains. Roy prepped the evening mise en place and watched the sky outside and felt the particular unease that had no object, yet the low-frequency awareness that something was gathering. At 4 in the afternoon, Amy pinned a new order to the corkboard. Roy dried his hands and looked at it. 5 large pizzas. Pickup at 7:30, delivery by 7:45. Address, Steel Reapers, MC, Old Creek Road, 6 miles northeast. He looked at the address for a moment longer than he looked at most things. Then he looked at Amy. She was already wiping down the prep station with her particular efficiency, moving with the focused energy of someone who has already had the internal conversation and reached a conclusion and is now simply waiting for the external conversation to catch up. "I'll take that delivery," Roy said. She didn't stop wiping. "I've got it, Mr. Weston." Amy, she looked up. His voice was level. His expression was what she had learned to call his quiet face, the face he wore when something mattered more than he was going to say out loud. "Let me take that one." She set down the cloth. She straightened. "I need the tips," she said. "Tommy's surgery is in 3 months. Every dollar counts." The words were simple and offered no room for argument because they were not an argument. They were just the truth. Roy looked at her for a moment. He thought about the envelope in the drawer. He thought about the red notebook. He thought about what $42,000 and climbing felt like, when you were the one carrying it toward a number that kept staying ahead of you no matter how fast you moved. He thought about what he knew about the Steel Reapers MC. "All right," he said finally. He said it in the voice she had learned to recognize as the voice he used when he had decided to let something happen, while privately deciding what he was going to do about it. "But you call me when you get there," he said, "when you hand over the pizzas, when you leave." "All 3 calls," she nodded. "Amy," she met his eyes. "I've seen enough of this world to know when something doesn't sit right. This doesn't sit right. So if anything feels off when you get there, you leave. Leave the pizzas. Leave the money. Don't explain and don't apologize. Just go." "I understand," she said. He looked at her a moment longer. "Pride isn't worth your safety," he said. "No amount of money is." "I understand," she said again. She said it in the way of a person who understood the words, but had already weighed the risk and decided it was acceptable because the alternative, the smaller number in the notebook, the surgery still 3 months away, felt like a different kind of danger. Roy packaged the 5 pizzas in the insulated delivery bag. He checked each box. He added napkins and paper plates, the small reflexes of preparation. He handed her the bag. He watched her zip her jacket. He watched her take the bag and settle it in the basket of her bicycle, her taillight blinking red in the October dusk as she turned onto Clifford Street and then onto Main, and then disappeared around the corner at the end of the block. Roy stood at the window until there was nothing left to watch. Then he went to the back of the shop. He cleaned the prep station. He wiped down the oven doors. He mopped the floor. His hands worked independently of his mind, which was 6 miles northeast of town, on a bicycle on a county road in the dark. The radio played a sad song about a man who loved someone and lost them. Roy turned it off. The silence had weight to it. Direction. At 7:55, his phone rang. He picked it up before the first ring had finished. Amy's voice came through unsteady with the unsteadiness of someone working hard to sound calm. "I'm here," she said. "They're opening the boxes." He could hear the background and engine idling music thumping from inside a building. Men's voices, the overlapping loudness of a group that had been drinking for a while and had grown comfortable with its own noise. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, I think so. They're just—" She stopped mid-sentence. He heard it. He heard the voice that rose above the others, deep and rough, carrying the casual cruelty of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything. "These pizzas are cold." Amy's voice smaller. "I'm sorry, I got here as fast as I could. It's 6 miles by bicycle. 6 miles on a bicycle." The voice again, contempt sharpening around the words even as he repeated them. "What kind of operation are you people running? I can take them back if you want a refund." The sound of cardboard hitting pavement. More than one box, a beat of silence. Amy's voice barely audible. "Please, I didn't mean to." The sound of flesh hitting flesh. A single sound, sharp and flat and final. Amy was not speaking anymore. There was the sound of her hitting the pavement, the clatter of her phone skittering across asphalt. Then laughter, real laughter, easy and warm, the laughter of men who found this genuinely funny. The phone didn't disconnect. Roy heard all of it. He stood in his kitchen with the phone against his ear, and he heard Amy crying, trying to pull herself together, trying to find a voice that would let her apologize, or bargain, or do whatever was necessary. He heard her moving, gathering the boxes, her breath hitching. He heard footsteps. He heard someone pick up her phone from the ground. And then the voice, close now, speaking directly into the microphone, with a deliberateness that told Roy everything he needed to know about the man on the other end. "You hear that, old man?" the voice said. "That's what happens when you send little girls to do a man's job. Next time, deliver the pizza yourself. Or better yet, don't deliver at all." The line went dead. Roy set the phone on the counter. He stood in the silence of his kitchen. 5 seconds. He counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he was moving. He moved through the kitchen to the small office at the back of the shop, past the desk with the old Dell laptop and the filing cabinet, and the corkboard covered in delivery slips to the safe in the corner. There were 2 safes. The upper one he opened every day for the register float and the weekly deposit. That one he could open without thinking. He had opened it thousands of times, the lower safe smaller, gunmetal gray, with a different combination. A combination he had never written down anywhere because there was exactly one combination he would never forget. He had not opened since 2012. He knelt in front of it. His hands moved to the dial. Left, right, left. The mechanism released. The door swung open. Inside a metal box. Military green scratched from years of being transported to places that don't appear on tourist maps. Roy lifted the lid. Inside the box, 3 medals. Silver Star, Purple Heart, a commendation for valor that he had never framed and never would. Beneath the medals, a folded flag presented at Maggie's memorial service, the words, "Thank you for her service as a military spouse," printed above a signature he had never looked at closely enough to read. Beneath the flag, a photograph. 4 men in desert camouflage weapons slung across their backs, standing in a row with the ease of men who are very comfortable with both weapons and each other. The date was written on the back in marker. March 2004, Fallujah, Iraq. Roy looked at the photograph. He looked at his own face, 24 years younger. Harder in the way that sustained field service makes you hard, the way carbon is compacted under pressure. The man to his left was Hank Pruitt, weapons specialist. Could build an explosive device from materials available at any hardware store, had done so on multiple occasions in the service of his country, and had retired to a property outside Cody, Wyoming, where he raised cattle and answered the phone on the first ring for exactly 2 people in the world. The man to Hank's left was Cal Briggs, sniper. 12 years of active duty, not one missed confirmed shot. Cal lived somewhere in the hills outside Laramie and still shot targets at 1,000 yards on Tuesday mornings because, as he had explained to Roy once, some things you keep sharp because you never know. The man on the far right was Frank Tesoro. Frank had been Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance attached to their unit for a joint operation in the second week of March 2004. He had been 28 years old in that photograph. Lean and dark-haired and carrying a nervous energy that Roy had identified immediately as the energy of a man who had something to prove, probably to himself. Roy looked at Frank's face. He thought about what he had found on the screen 20 minutes ago when he searched the name Danny Tesoro. He set the photograph aside. At the bottom of the box, the satellite phone. Military issue mid-2000s model, the kind of hardware that had no market value anymore and every practical value imaginable. It worked anywhere in the world that had sky above it. One contact list. Not updated in 15 years. Roy picked it up, powered it on. The screen glowed green in the dim office. He scrolled to the name. Hank Pruitt. He pressed call. 2 rings. A voice answered, rough with sleep, the voice of a man woken by a phone that hasn't rung in a decade and is recalibrating fast. This number's been dead for 15 years. Who is this? It's Roy. Silence. Then Roy Weston. Yeah. Jesus Christ. I thought you were dead. Not yet. A beat. What's wrong? Roy looked at the medals in the box, at the photograph, at the phone that connected him to a past he had been content to let settle into the ground. I need help, Hank, he said. I need it tonight. Give me 3 hours. I'll bring Cal. Good. What are we walking into? Roy looked out the small window of his office at the dark street beyond, at Millhaven, sleeping peacefully at the mountains, invisible behind the night. A motorcycle club, he said. Steel Reapers, MC. Old Creek Road, 6 miles northeast. Drugs extortion. One of them just put my employee on the ground. Hank was quiet for a moment. How bad? She'll be all right, but it can't stand. Understood. What do you want the outcome to be? Roy thought about Amy counting tip money 3 times. He thought about the red notebook. He thought about Tommy Doyle and the surgery and the $80,000 that kept staying ahead of where the family was. I want to make sure it never happens again, he said. 3 hours, Hank said. Don't do anything stupid before we get there. Roy ended the call. He set the satellite phone on the desk beside the photograph. He opened the Dell laptop. He typed Danny Tesoro into the search bar. He hit enter. The results loaded. He read them once quickly. Then again slowly, the way you read things when the first pass has told you that the second pass is going to cost you something. Danny Tesoro, 34 years old, leader of the Steel Reapers, MC. Multiple arrests across a decade, assault, drug possession, intimidation. Nothing had ever stuck, which in Roy's experience indicated either very good lawyers or a system that had been arranged to accommodate the outcome. In this case, from what the public records suggested, the answer appeared to be both. Roy opened a second search. He typed Frank Tesoro, Montana. He read what came back. He sat back in his chair. The office was small, 4 steps in any direction, and you hit a wall. Roy had never minded small spaces. Small spaces were simple. Everything you needed was within reach. He sat with what the screen was telling him for a long moment. Then he understood what he was actually dealing with. Not a criminal operation with a villain at its center. A story, a long one, with a man he had known standing in the middle of it and a debt that had apparently been accruing interest for 16 years without either of them knowing. He looked at the Dell's screen. He looked at Frank Tesoro's prison photograph taken in 2010 at intake to Montana State Correctional, the face of a man who had spent his whole adult life running from something and had finally run out of road. He looked at Danny Tesoro's booking photo from 2019, the face of a younger man wearing the particular expression of someone who has learned that anger is the most reliable currency available to him and has been spending it freely for years. Same jaw, same set to the mouth, same thing behind the eyes, buried differently in each of them, but present in both. Roy had missed it the first time through the search results. He didn't miss it the second time. He closed the laptop. He needed to verify it, but he was already certain. He had learned over 20 years of operating in environments where the cost of being wrong was paid immediately to trust the pattern recognition that happened below the level of deliberate thought. It had kept him alive more times than he could count. It was telling him something now. He picked up the satellite phone one more time. He would call the prison tomorrow, verify the connection, understand what he was working with before he called in 2 men who had driven through the night to be here. For now, he put the photograph back in the box and closed the lid. He closed the safe. He went to the front of the shop. He called Amy. She didn't answer on the first ring, or the second, or the third. On the 4th ring, her voice came through, controlled in the way you get controlled after the first wave of something passes, and what remains is just the work of getting through it. Roy, she said, where are you? Almost back. Are you hurt? A pause. I'm okay. He let that sit for exactly 1 second. Come here first, he said, before you go home. She came through the door 11 minutes later. Her coat was torn at the right shoulder. Her jeans had road grit on the knee from where she had gone down. The left side of her face was swelling red, already the kind of swelling that would darken and deepen by morning. Her lip had been split and had stopped bleeding. A thin line of dried blood ran along her chin that she had tried to clean away somewhere along the road home. She was standing, she was moving. She was holding herself together with the determination of someone who has decided that falling apart is a luxury she cannot currently afford. Roy was around the counter before she reached it. She flinched when he moved toward her. Small, automatic. the reflex of a body that had recorded what just happened and was not yet certain the recording was finished. Then she caught herself and steadied and let him guide her to the chair behind the counter. He didn't touch her face. He didn't rush. He moved slowly and spoke in the voice he had learned to use in environments where panic was the most dangerous thing. Present, the voice that says everything is under control, especially when it isn't. Tell me what happened, he said. He already knew. He asked because she needed to say it. She told him. He listened. He listened to all of it. The cold pizza and the boxes thrown down and the $50 taken from her pocket while she was on the ground. The laughter, the voice on the phone. She told it steadily without drama, the way Amy Doyle tended to do things, straight through, no embellishment. When she finished, Roy asked one question. Did he do anything else? She shook her head. He took the money and told me to leave. Roy nodded. His jaw was tight. One muscle along his cheekbone contracted once briefly, then released. His voice stayed level. Where are they now? Still at the clubhouse. There were 12, maybe 15 of them. He thought about the $50. Amy counted every cent. $50 was 4 hours of work. $50 was one step closer to 80,000, which was one day closer to a surgery that Tommy Doyle needed to be alive in 10 years. Roy looked at her, at the torn coat, at the swelling that would be worse by morning, at the hands she was trying to hold still and almost managing to. He thought about the daughter he and Maggie never had. He thought about Maggie's note. Make it a place where people feel safe. I want you to go home, he said. Rest tonight. She started to argue. He waited until she looked at him directly. You did nothing wrong, he said. Not one thing. What happened tonight was their fault, and entirely theirs. Don't carry their shame. Something in his voice, not the volume of it, which hadn't changed, the quality underneath. The voice of a man who has made a decision, not in anger, not in haste, but with the specific calm of someone who has been here before and knows what it is and has done the accounting already. Amy looked at him for a moment. She gathered her bag. She stood, winced, steadied. At the door, she turned back. Mr. Weston, she said, please be careful. Roy looked at her across the kitchen. I've been in worse situations than this, he said, a long time ago. She didn't look entirely convinced, but she went. The door closed. Roy stood alone in his pizza shop. The ovens ticked as they cooled. He looked at Maggie's photograph on the wall, her head thrown back, her eyes closed, the laugh that had filled every room she was ever in. He looked at her for a moment, then he went back to work. He cleaned the prep station. He wiped down the oven faces. He restocked the prep refrigerator for tomorrow. He did all the closing tasks that habit had made mechanical, and while his hands worked, his mind was already somewhere else. It was running the problem the way he had always run problems. Not through it, around it, finding the edges, understanding the shape, identifying what was actually in play before committing to a course of action. He knew what he was going to do. He had known from the moment he put the satellite phone back in the box. He was going to call Frank Tesoro in the morning and verify what the search results were suggesting. He was going to spend 48 hours gathering intelligence before he moved. He was going to bring Hank and Cal in because 2 pairs of eyes and 2 sets of skills he trusted completely were worth more than any alternative. And at the end of those 48 hours, he was going to make sure that the man who put Amy Doyle on the ground understood in terms that could not be misunderstood that Millhaven was no longer a viable place for him to operate. He was also going to be careful, because he was 68 years old and his knees reminded him of that when he moved too fast and the men he was dealing with were younger and more numerous and operating on their home ground. He knew all of this. He also knew something else. He had spent 2 decades operating in environments where the other side had better resources, better positioning, better numbers. He had survived all of them, not by matching force with force, but by being more patient, more observant, and more willing to do the careful work that most people find too slow. Youth and violence are loud. Experience is quiet. Quiet wins. Outside, gravel crunched. Headlights swept across the office window. An old Ford F-150 with Wyoming plates pulled up to the curb. Roy looked at the clock on the wall. 8:51. Hank had made it in under 3 hours. Roy set down the cleaning cloth. He moved through the kitchen to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. Hank Pruitt was standing in the parking lot, gray-bearded and leather-jacketed, and wearing the expression of a man who has driven 160 miles in the dark because he was asked to, and would drive it again without needing to be asked twice. Beside him, Cal Briggs, taller, leaner, with pale gray eyes that had spent years looking through scopes at targets 1,000 yards away. Cal said nothing. He nodded once. Roy looked at them. 2 old men who had no business doing what they were about to do. Two men who would do it anyway. 20 years, Hank said. 20 years, and the first thing you do is call me into something like this. Roy held the door open. Come inside, he said. I'll tell you everything. They went in. Roy locked the door. He flipped the sign in the window to closed. He started the coffee. And somewhere in the distance, 6 miles up Old Creek Road, the Steel Reapers MC drank and laughed and had no idea what was coming. No idea at all. The maps came out first. Roy kept them in a flat drawer under the prep counter topographic maps of the county that he had acquired years ago from a friend at the Land Records office and never had a reason to use until now. He spread the largest one across the stainless steel surface of the prep table and smoothed its edges with the flat of his hand, while Hank poured himself a cup of coffee without asking, and Cal stood at the window looking out at the empty street with his arms crossed and his pale eyes moving in small, systematic arcs across the dark. Roy put his finger on a point 6 miles northeast of where they were standing. Old Creek Road, he said. Former auto repair shop converted. Main building, 2 outbuildings. What looks like a modified barn they use for storage. Property sits back about 200 yards from the road. Tree line on the south and east sides. Open ground to the north. Hank leaned over the map. How many? 20 confirmed. Possibly more that cycle in and out. Weapons assume everyone is armed. Pistols at minimum. They cook methamphetamine on that property. Men who cook meth and run a protection operation in 3 counties do not leave themselves underarmed. Cal hadn't moved from the window. Security setup, he asked without turning around. Unknown, Roy said. That's what tomorrow is for. Hank looked up from the map. 48 hours, he said. That's what you said on the phone. That's what I said. And at the end of 48 hours, Roy looked at the map, at the point his finger had been resting on, at the 6 miles of county road between that point and where he was standing. At the end of 48 hours, he said, we make them understand that staying in Millhaven is no longer a viable option. Hank absorbed this. By viable, you mean? I mean costly in ways they are not prepared to absorb. Cal turned from the window. He looked at Roy with the pale, steady eyes of a man who has spent his career making precise calculations about distance and wind and the physics of a bullet in flight. You're not talking about killing anyone, Cal said. It was not quite a question. No, Hank set down his coffee. Roy, he said, we're 66 and 64 years old. Between the 3 of us, we have 1 functioning knee, 1 partially reconstructed shoulder, and enough accumulated soft tissue damage to fill a small medical journal. You understand that, right? I understand that. And you're proposing that the 3 of us spend 48 hours conducting surveillance on an active criminal organization and then execute some kind of operation designed to make them voluntarily relocate. That is essentially what I'm proposing. Hank looked at Cal. Cal looked at Hank. Something passed between them that had no words. It was the specific communication of men who have operated together long enough that language has become optional for most things. Hank picked up his coffee again. All right, he said, walk us through what you know. Roy walked them through it. He told them about Amy. He told them about the delivery and the phone call and the sound of the slap through the speaker and the laughter that followed it. He told them about Amy walking back through the door with her face swollen and $50 missing from her pocket and her hands working hard to hold still. He told them about Tommy Doyle and the surgery and the red notebook. He told them about the safe in the back office and the photograph from Fallujah. He told them about Frank Tesoro, and then he told them about what he had found when he searched the name Danny Tesoro on his old Dell laptop in the small hours after Amy had gone home. He laid it out carefully the way he had always laid things out, not dramatically, not with any flourish, just in sequence, one fact after another, because facts in sequence tell you more than facts in isolation. And he had found over a long career that the people worth talking to already understood that. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. The ovens had fully cooled. The radio was off. Outside, something moved in the alley behind the shop. A cat, probably, or the wind working at a loose piece of signage. Roy registered it and dismissed it in about a quarter of a second. Hank said, "You're sure about the connection?" "I ran it 3 times, Roy said. Cal said nothing. He was looking at the map again. Looking at the 6 miles between Weston's Corner and the Steel Reapers property on Old Creek Road. "It's the same family," Roy said. "Same name, same timeline. The Marine I pulled out of that burning street in Fallujah and the man who put Amy on the ground tonight and are connected by a line that runs directly through my decision to go off mission 20 years ago." "And you think that matters?" Hank asked. To the operation, Roy looked at the photograph he had set on the counter. "I think it might be the only thing that matters," he said. Hank looked at the 4 young men in desert camouflage, at Frank Tesoro on the far right with his nervous energy, and his empty rifle in his 28 years. He said, "We start surveillance at 5 tomorrow morning." Roy nodded. "Cal, I'll need a position with clear sight lines to the main building and both outbuildings. Something with concealment. 150 meters minimum from the perimeter." "There's a ridge on the south side," Roy said. "Used to be a hunting blind up there. I drove past it a few weeks ago. Still standing." "How's the approach?" "Through the tree line. 90 minutes in the dark if you move carefully. 45 if you don't care about being quiet." "I always care about being quiet," Cal said. Roy almost smiled. They worked until 2 in the morning. They marked positions on the map. They established radio frequencies. They worked out signal protocols, 2 clicks for all clear, 3 for movement, a voice call only if something required immediate decision. They established rally points at 2 locations, one half a mile east of the Steel Reapers property, and one at a rest area on Route 12, 10 miles west. They ate leftover pizza from the prep refrigerator and drank too much coffee and moved around the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of men who have planned operations in worse conditions than a pizza shop at midnight. At 2 in the morning, Hank and Cal went to a motel on the edge of town. Roy locked the shop and went upstairs to his apartment. He did not sleep for a long time. He lay in the dark with his hands folded behind his head and looked at the ceiling and thought about Frank Tesoro. He thought about the man Frank had been at 28, the nervous energy, the need to prove something, the kind of young man who joins a branch of service known for its difficulty, because difficulty is the only proving ground that feels sufficient when you are trying to outrun something inside yourself. He thought about the file on the screen, the timeline of Frank's life after the Marines, the dishonorable discharge in 2015 for conduct unbecoming, the arrest in 2016, assault charges dropped, the arrest in 2017, drug trafficking, probation, the bar in Billings in 2018, and the man who said something about Frank's family and the decision that Frank made in the seconds after the decision that had cost him everything and was still costing him. Roy thought about the particular cruelty of that last detail, that the thing that finally destroyed Frank Tesoro was someone saying something about his family, the family he had walked out on, the son he had abandoned and come back to and been too ashamed to claim. He thought about Danny Tesoro, 34 years old, built from the wreckage of Frank's choices. Roy closed his eyes. He slept eventually. He dreamed of Fallujah as he sometimes did, and in the dream it went exactly the way it had gone in reality, which was the worst kind of dream there is. The surveillance ran for a full day and a half. Hank and Cal were in position on the South Ridge before 5 in the morning, settled into the old hunting blind with binoculars and a thermos of black coffee, and the patience of men who have spent entire days waiting for something to happen and have made their peace with the waiting. Roy monitored from the shop using a set of traffic camera feeds that he was not officially authorized to access a favor owed him by a man he had helped out of a professional difficulty in 2011, the kind of favor that doesn't expire. The picture that assembled itself over the following 36 hours was detailed and not encouraging. 22 confirmed members, not the 15 that the county's casual intelligence had suggested. The security rotation was more professional than Roy had expected from a rural motorcycle club. Guards at the main entrance changed every 4 hours, not every 6, and the changeover overlapped by 15 minutes, meaning there was no window during the shift change when the perimeter was under-observed. The cameras on the building were consumer grade, the kind you could buy at any hardware store, but there were 9 of them covering angles that suggested someone had thought carefully about placement. At 1 in the afternoon on Friday, a black Escalade with tinted windows arrived. 2 men in business attire got out, went inside, stayed 40 minutes, and left with a duffel bag. Roy ran the plates through his county contact and traced the registration through 3 shell companies to a law office in Billings that represented, among other clients, a city councilman named Webb, who owned 4 car dealerships in 3 counties and had been on the Millhaven City Council for 11 years. Roy called Sheriff Lou Garrett. He asked his question, carefully framing it as hypothetical as professional curiosity. Garrett listened. Then Garrett said in the voice of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, "They run their money through Webb's dealerships. Webb kicks back to the mayor. The mayor makes sure the DA treats their arrests as low priority." "How high does it go?" Roy asked. "High enough that I can't touch it without evidence that is completely watertight," Garrett said. "And getting that evidence would require resources I don't have and warrants I couldn't get, because the judge who handles warrant applications in this county had 3 cars repaired for free at one of Webb's dealerships last year." Roy sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "I appreciate the information, Lou." Roy Garrett said, "Whatever you're thinking, don't." Roy didn't answer that. He ended the call. He opened the old laptop. He searched Frank Tesoro one more time, reading more carefully this time, looking for the things between the facts, the small details that the facts themselves don't tell you. He found the prison's contact information. He called. He accepted the charges. Frank Tesoro's voice came through after a long wait, the voice of a man who has been in an enclosed space for 23 years and has developed the particular quality of stillness that comes from having nowhere to go and learning to inhabit that fact. Chief Grimes, Frank said. Roy heard the recognition, the recalibration, the very particular quality of surprise that arrives when the past calls you on a Tuesday afternoon and turns out to be real. It's Roy, not Chief, not anymore. A pause. It's been a long time, it has. Another pause. Roy said, one of your people put my employee on the ground last night. Young woman, 22 years old, delivering pizza. He slapped her. Took $50 from her pocket while she was down. The silence that followed had weight to it. I'm sorry, Frank said. Genuinely, I'm very sorry. I need to ask you something about Danny Tesoro. Roy heard the breath change on the other end of the line. The pause that followed was different from the pauses before it. It was not the pause of a man thinking about what to say. It was the pause of a man who has been waiting for a very long time for a particular door to open and is not entirely certain he wants to walk through it. What do you want to know? Frank said carefully. I want to know who he is to you, Roy said. The records say brother. Another pause. Longer. Roy waited. He's not my brother, Frank said. Roy said nothing. He's my son, Frank said. I had him when I was 20. His mother and I weren't together. I wasn't ready. I wasn't anything close to ready. I joined up to escape it, to escape all of it. Roy looked at the photograph on the counter. At Frank's face in March 2004, 28 years old, running for 8 years by then. Still running. When I got out, Frank said, when everything went wrong and I was looking at a sentence and my life had turned into the thing I'd always been afraid of, I looked him up. Danny. He was 23. He was already involved with those people. I thought if I told him I was his father after everything, after 23 years of nothing, I thought he'd. Frank stopped. I told him I was his brother, Frank said, because I was ashamed. Because saying I'm your brother feels like showing up. Saying I'm your father feels like accounting for the absence. Roy understood the distinction. He doesn't know, Roy said. He suspects, Frank said. I think he's always suspected. But he's never had anyone confirm it, and I've never had the courage to. Roy looked at the photograph for a long moment. You built him, Roy said. Not harshly, just as fact. You built him out of your absence and your shame and the story you told him instead of the truth. And now he's doing to other people what was done to him. Frank was quiet. I know, he said. I know that. Roy said, I saved your life in Fallujah, Frank. I know that too. And you told me you'd make it count. Frank said nothing. The line was quiet except for the ambient sound of an institutional environment, distant voices, a door opening and closing somewhere far away. I know what I did with it, Frank said. Believe me, Roy, I know. Roy said, I'm going to try to stop this without anyone getting killed. But I need you to understand that the man who hurt that girl is your son, not your brother, your son. And that if there's anything you can do, anything at all from where you are to help me reach him, I need you to think about that. Frank said, what are you going to do, Roy? Roy said, I'm going to try to reach him the way I once reached you. Another long silence. Then Frank said, I'll think about it. Roy said, don't think too long. He ended the call. He set the phone down. He looked at the ceiling. 23 years old Danny had been when Frank found him. 23 and already building something. Something that filled the space where a father was supposed to be. The way things always fill empty spaces, not with what belongs there, but with whatever is available. Roy thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The surveillance produced one more piece of critical information. At 6 in the evening on Friday, Cal's voice came over the radio in the flat, precise tone of a man reporting what he sees without editorializing. Movement, he said. Big gathering. Count is climbing. Roy was at the laptop watching the traffic feeds. How many? 18, 20. Still coming in. Looks like a full assembly. Can you get audio negative? Too far. Wind direction is wrong. Roy watched the feeds. Watched the motorcycles arriving in groups of 2 and 3. Their headlights sweeping the property as they turned in from Old Creek Road. Hank's voice on the radio. They were talking about a shipment. Saturday night. Everyone present. I'm reading lips on the tall one near the east entrance. Tomorrow he's saying, big one. Roy sat forward. How big, Hank? big enough that they're all smiling about it. Roy looked at the map. Saturday night. If the entire organization was present for a major shipment, the property would be fully staffed. Maximum personnel, maximum distraction, maximum opportunity, but also maximum risk. He thought about what that meant. He thought about what was possible. He sat with the map for a long time after Hank and Cal returned that night, all three of them around the prep table with the overhead light humming and the streets outside quiet. He laid it out. We don't attack them, he said. Hank, obviously, we make them think someone else is. Roy pointed to the map. The power lines run along the north side of the property. We cut service to the whole area. Consumer equipment loses power. Cameras go dark. Their communications go to handheld radio only, and their radio discipline is not going to be their strongest attribute. Cal, and then we give them something to look at in the wrong direction. Roy moved his finger south. There's a dry field on the south side 150 meters from the tree line. 5 road flares spaced 20 feet apart. They'll see fire. They'll split their response. Some to investigate the flares, some to guard the shipment. And in that window, Hank asked. Roy reached into his jacket and produced a single sheet of paper. He had typed it on the laptop that afternoon and printed it on the small printer in the back office. He smoothed it on the table. We deliver a message. Hank read it. We are watching. We know everything. Leave Millhaven or face the consequences. Hank looked up. You want to leave them a note, he said. I want to make them paranoid, Roy said. I want them looking over their shoulders, wondering who's watching, wondering what we know and how we know it. Paranoid people make mistakes. Paranoid organizations fracture. Members start questioning leadership. Leadership starts seeing threats that aren't there. The whole structure gets noisy and inefficient and starts making decisions based on fear instead of information. Cal said psychological operations. Roy looked at him. Exactly. Cal considered this. Hank considered it. It's not nothing. Hank said finally. It's the only play that doesn't end with one of us in a cell or all of us in the ground, Roy said. We're 68, 66, and 64. We're not kicking down doors. We're ghosts. We move fast, we leave no trace, and we let their own imagination do the rest of the work. Hank, and if it doesn't work, Roy, then we adapt. That was the plan. It was not a perfect plan. No plan is. But it was workable and it was proportionate and it accounted for the real variables in a way that a less experienced man might not have accounted for them. They ran through contingencies until midnight. Then they went to sleep. The call from Patricia Doyle came in at noon on Saturday. Roy was behind the counter running the lunch service alone, which he had done every other Saturday for 15 years when Amy had her shift at the pharmacy. The lunch orders were steady. Nothing unusual. The radio was playing and the oven was running and the Saturday light was coming through the front windows in long, pale rectangles that moved across the floor as the afternoon turned. When his phone rang and he saw an unfamiliar number with a Millhaven exchange, he answered it the way he answered every call cleanly and without hesitation. Mr. Weston, the voice said. This is Patricia Doyle, Amy's mother. Roy set down the dough scraper. Is Amy all right? The voice caught slightly. That's why I'm calling. She left this morning. She said she was going to the library to study. She was supposed to be home by noon, and she's not answering her phone, and she always texts if she's going to be late. She always. Roy was already moving toward the back of the shop. When did you last hear from her? 9 this morning. She texted me, said she'd be home by noon. Did she say anything else, anything unusual? Patricia was quiet for a moment. She asked me something. She asked if I thought people could forgive terrible things, if real forgiveness was possible. I said yes, I think it is if someone is genuinely sorry. And she said she loved me. And then she left. Roy understood immediately. He had seen it before. Not in this context, not in this life, but in other ones. The particular clarity that comes over a person before they do something that they know is dangerous. The quality of resolve that makes people tidy their affairs first. Emotional affairs, the things that matter, the things they want to have said. Mrs. Doyle, he said, I need you to stay home. Stay by your phone. I believe I know where she is. Should I call the police? Give me 1 hour, Roy said. He was in his truck before he finished the sentence. He drove fast. He didn't stop to call Hank or Cal. He drove the 6 miles of county road in 8 minutes with his jaw set and his hands steady on the wheel and something cold working through the center of his chest that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but had elements of both and was more useful than either. He parked a 1/4 mile from the Steel Reaper's property. He went the rest of the way on foot. through the tree line on the eastern edge, moving low and carefully following the path that memory and 2 days of studying the approach had mapped for him. He reached the tree line's edge and crouched in the shadow of a pine tree, with bark rough against his palm, and looked down at the property below. The parking lot held 14 motorcycles. A Saturday afternoon. Some of the membership had not yet arrived for the evening gathering. The main building was active lights, on voices audible even at this distance. And in the parking lot, Amy's bicycle leaned against a fence post on the left side of the entrance. The blue tape on the handlebar that Roy had put there 3 months ago, when he repaired the grip, was visible even from this distance. And Amy herself, standing in front of the main entrance, alone, her hands at her sides, her chin up, her posture, carrying the specific quality of someone who is frightened and has decided to act anyway because the alternative is to stay frightened. She was raising her hand to knock on the door for what appeared to be the second or third time the knock of someone who is already committed to this and is seeing it through. Roy's jaw tightened. He watched. The door opened. Danny Tesoro stepped out. Roy had seen photographs, the booking photos, and the social media images that his research had assembled over 2 days, but photographs don't carry the quality of a person the way presence does. Danny Tesoro was tall and broad across the shoulders, with the build of someone who has spent time working with his hands. Real work, not gym work. He was younger looking than 34, which people often are when they have lived at a speed that doesn't leave time for the particular kind of aging that comes from sitting still. Behind him, 2 members filed out. Danny looked at Amy. His expression was the specific expression of someone confronted with something that doesn't fit the pattern of their expectations. And Danny Tesoro, Roy could see, even from the tree line, was a man who had very established patterns. His grin arrived a moment later. Practiced. Reflexive. Well, he said. His voice carried in the October air. Little delivery girl came back. Roy watched Amy. She didn't step back. She said something. Roy was too far away to hear the words clearly, but he could hear the tone, the steadiness in it, the particular quality of someone speaking from a decision already made rather than from the moment itself. Danny's grin changed. Roy had been watching faces in difficult situations for most of his adult life, and he knew what it looked like when a man's ego registered a challenge that it had not been prepared for. He knew what came next. He had watched it enough times to know the sequence almost before it happened. Danny's hand moved to his belt, to the pistol. Roy was out of the tree line before he had consciously decided to move. 30 yards. His knees protested. He ignored them. His lungs protested. He ignored those too. His body remembered things his age was trying to make him forget: the specific angles of approach, the geometry of closing distance, the way you carry your weight when you're moving fast and may need to change direction. He covered the ground in 4 seconds. He hit Danny Tesoro at the midline, driving his shoulder into the man's sternum, carrying the momentum low, the way you do it when you need to take someone down without letting them get their hands up first. They went down together. The pistol came loose and slid across the pavement. Roy rolled and came up in a fighting stance, weight balanced, hands up, the position his body had defaulted to 10,000 times in training, and a number of times he didn't like to count in practice. Danny came up faster than Roy expected, faster and angrier. The 2 men behind him started forward, and then the rifle shot cracked across the parking lot like a board, breaking sharp and flat and unmistakable. The bullet hit the asphalt 6 inches from the left foot of the man in front. The sound rolled out across the flat ground and the tree line and the dry fields and came back as an echo. Everyone stopped. Cal's voice, when it came over the radio in Roy's ear, was entirely calm. "Next one is in a kneecap," Cal said. "Step away from the old man, both of you." The 2 men stepped back. Danny looked around the property, trying to locate the shooter, his eyes moving across the ridge line in a fast sweep that found nothing. There was nothing to find. Cal Briggs at 800 yards was invisible in ways that went beyond concealment, the invisibility of a man who had made absence into a skill. Roy reached back and found Amy's arm. She was behind him. He could feel her shaking. "Move," he said quietly. "Walk. Don't run." She walked. He walked behind her, facing Danny Tesoro, keeping himself between Amy and the pistol still lying on the pavement, moving backward at the pace of someone who is leaving by choice. Roy Hank's voice on the radio. "I'm 2 minutes out." "Don't," Roy said quietly. "Hold position." Danny watched Roy moving away from him across the parking lot, and his face went through several things in quick succession: anger and calculation, and the particular frustration of a man who has been made to feel small in front of witnesses and cannot immediately identify a way to respond to it. He said nothing. Roy reached Amy's bicycle. He took it with his left hand. He did not turn his back on Danny Tesaro until he was through the entrance gate and onto the road. Sheriff Garrett's cruiser came around the bend from the east 30 seconds later, lights flashing, no siren. Garrett drove them to the road. Roy put Amy's bicycle in the back. He got in the front. Garrett drove without speaking for a mile. Then he said, "She all right?" "She's all right, Roy." "I know." What the hell was she thinking? "She was thinking that forgiveness is a real thing and that someone needed to offer it," Roy said. "She was wrong about the timing. She wasn't wrong about the rest." Garrett pulled over on the county road. He looked at Roy. "This ends now," he said. "I mean it. Whatever you're planning for tonight, you stand down." Roy looked out the window at the dry grass along the road's edge, brown and flat in the October light. "Lou," he said, "you told me yourself the system can't touch them. I told you it was complicated. You told me the DA won't move without evidence so airtight it couldn't leak. You told me the judge is compromised. You told me Webb runs the political cover. That's not complicated. That's closed." Garrett looked at his hands on the steering wheel. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Tonight," Roy said, "I'm going to make them understand they're being watched." "And after tonight," Roy looked at him. "After tonight," he said, "we'll see what's still left to do." Garrett drove them into town. He dropped Amy at the shop. He sat with Roy for a moment after Amy went inside. "You need to understand something," Garrett said. "These people have 30 years of operating in this county with nobody touching them. They have lawyers and they have money and they have people in places that matter. You go at them and they will not just push back, they will dismantle you. They'll find everything there is to find about you and they'll use all of it." Roy said, "I've operated in environments where the other side had better resources and better positioning than I did." Garrett said, "This isn't a war zone." Roy looked at him. Sometimes Roy said the difference is smaller than you'd think. He got out of the car. He went inside. He told Hank and Cal what had happened. He told them the plan was still on for tonight. Neither of them argued. The operation ran at 10 o'clock. 3 vehicles, 3 routes converging on the Steel Reaper's property from different directions, with the timing that comes from planning and from the muscle memory of men who have coordinated movements in darkness before. Roy parked a mile out and went in on foot through the eastern tree line. He carried the road flares in a backpack and the note in his jacket pocket printed on plain paper folded twice. No weapons. He had agreed with himself before they left the shop that this night would not end with anyone dead. That was the line. That was where it started and where it stayed. He moved through the trees. The cold was deep now, the serious cold, the kind that Montana saves for October nights, when it wants you to understand who is actually in charge. His breath misted in the dark. His knees ached. His back made its opinions known on the subject of moving quickly through uneven ground at 68 years old. He ignored all of it. The property was fully lit when he reached the edge of the tree line on the south side. The parking lot held 20 motorcycles. A white panel van was backed up to the side entrance of the main building. Its rear doors open, 2 men Roy didn't recognize carrying wrapped packages inside under the supervision of Danny Tesaro himself. The shipment, on schedule. Roy checked his radio. Position 1, Hank's voice barely a breath. "I have eyes on the transformer. Ready?" Position 2, Cal from somewhere in the dark to the east. 19 heat signatures in the main building. 4 outside. Wind is light from the southwest. "I'm established." Roy pressed his transmit button twice, all clear. He set the backpack down in the shadow of the tree line and began pulling out flares. 5 of them. He worked methodically, spacing them along the field's edge at 20-foot intervals, pushing the spike of each one into the frozen ground so it would stand upright and burn without falling. He didn't light them yet. He pressed transmit. "Package delivery in 60 seconds. Execute on my mark." He waited. He looked at the property, at Danny Tesaro moving between the van and the building, at the 20 other men moving with the particular loose energy of a group that has been drinking since noon and is now handling something that makes them feel important. "At all of it, Mark," he said. Hank moved first. The charge he had placed on the transformer earlier that day was small and precise, the kind of thing that looks afterward exactly like what it was supposed to look like, which was an equipment failure. There was a sound like a single sharp crack from the north side of the property. Then every light went out. The building floods the pole lamps, the string lights across the parking lot that someone had installed at some point, because criminals, like everyone else, sometimes want their outdoor spaces to look festive. All of it went dark in the same instant. Voices from the property. Shouting. Flashlight beams clicking on phone screens, glowing the scattered light of 20 people trying to orient themselves in sudden darkness. Roy struck the first flare. It bloomed red and furious in the night, the particular red of road flares urgent and unmistakable, the color of something wrong. He struck the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. A line of fire in the darkness burning south of the property, impossible to miss, impossible to explain without investigation. From the property, Danny's voice cut through the noise. South side, there's a fire south of the fence. Ray, take 4 men and check it out. Henderson, get the generator running. Everyone else stay on the package. The organization split, exactly as planned. 5 men with flashlights moving toward the flares, their voices carrying in the cold air. What is this? Road flares. Why would someone put road flares in the middle of nowhere? Roy was already moving. He left the tree line on the southeast corner of the property, moving low, staying in the deep shadow cast by the main building. No lights, no noise. His knees complained at the pace he was setting. He noted the complaint and set it aside. He reached the back wall of the main building. No guards on this side. They were all out front protecting the shipment or out back investigating the flares. He pulled the note from his jacket pocket. He unfolded it. He pressed it flat against the back door at eye level, secured it with 2 strips of tape from the roll he had brought. We are watching. We know everything. Leave Millhaven or face the consequences. He was turning to leave when he heard the footstep. Close. 6 feet. A flashlight swept around the corner of the building and caught him full in the face. A young man, 25 at most, one of the ones who had been assigned to stay with the package, now apparently doing a perimeter check that hadn't been part of the original plan. The young man's eyes went wide. He was reaching for his pistol. Roy moved. The distance closed in 2 steps. He grabbed the wrist as the hand closed on the pistol. Grip applied rotational pressure to the joint. The kind of technique that is completely reliable and completely silent, in which Roy had practiced so many times it happened without thought. The pistol hit the ground. Roy caught the young man before he could shout, pivoted behind him, applied the hold. Blood choke, not air. The distinction matters. Air chokes are painful and unreliable and leave evidence. Blood chokes are precise, cause no lasting harm, and produce unconsciousness in under 10 seconds in a calm subject and closer to 15 in someone who is fighting. This one fought for about 12. Roy lowered him to the ground. He checked the pulse, strong and regular. He dragged him behind the dumpster on the east side of the building. He took the man's radio. He moved. Cal's voice in his ear, quiet and urgent. Roy. 2 more coming around the east wall. 20 seconds. Roy ran. He ran toward the motorcycle lot. He dropped between 2 Harleys flat against the cold ground, his face turned away from the flashlight beams that swept the area 2 seconds after he hit the ground. The 2 men came around the corner. Jake, one of them called. Jake, you back here. They found Jake behind the dumpster. Their voices went loud and alarmed. Roy lay between the motorcycles and did not breathe in any way that could be heard. The 2 men picked Jake up and carried him toward the main building. They passed 8 feet from where Roy was lying. Neither of them looked between the bikes. Roy exhaled. He waited 30 seconds. Then he moved through the motorcycle lot to the fence line and over it and into the trees. He was 400 meters into the tree line when Hank's voice came through the radio. Package delivered, Hank said, returning to rally point. Roy pressed transmit twice. Acknowledged. He moved through the dark toward his truck. Behind him through the trees, he could hear the voices from the property changing. The note had been found. Danny's voice rising above the others, reading the words aloud. We are watching. We know everything. A silence fell over the property. The kind of silence that follows the arrival of something that doesn't fit any existing category. Then Danny's voice, loud and angry, and underneath the anger, something else. Something Roy recognized from other contexts, from other operations, the specific quality of a man who is scared and is responding to that fear with aggression, because aggression is the only language available to him. Who the hell is watching us? Danny said. Who is this? Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Roy reached his truck. He started the engine. He drove away with his headlights off until he reached the county road. Then he turned them on. He drove into the night, and he thought it worked. For 4 miles, he thought it had worked. They met at the rest stop on Route 12. 3 trucks in the dark parked side by side. Roy got out. Hank got out. Cal got out. They stood in the cold and looked at each other. We pulled it off, Hank said. He was grinning. Actually pulled it off. Roy nodded. He should have felt something clean. The satisfaction of a plan executed well. The particular relief of an operation completed without casualties. Instead, he had the feeling he'd had before in other contexts, the feeling that arrives when things have gone well for too long and the correction is on its way. His radio crackled. He'd forgotten he was still carrying the radio he'd taken off Jake. Danny's voice came through, addressing someone by name. Henderson, get me a line to the Reno chapter. And the Idaho boys. Tell them we have a situation. Roy looked at Hank. Hank had heard it too. Call it 50 men, Roy said, maybe more. Hank stopped grinning. They're reading this as a rival gang move, Roy said. They're not scared. They're mobilizing. Cal said nothing. Roy looked at the radio in his hand. He had spent 48 hours planning an operation designed to end this quietly. Designed to make them feel watched and hunted and isolated until staying felt more costly than leaving. Instead, he had handed Danny Tesaro a threat that looked exactly like the beginning of a gang war. And Danny Tesaro's response to the beginning of a gang war was to call in every ally he had from 3 states and prepare to fight. Roy's phone buzzed, a text from Lou Garrett. Call me, now, he called. Garrett didn't waste time. I'm getting reports from 3 counties, Garrett said. Motorcycle groups on the move, all heading toward Millhaven. Talking to my counterpart in Boise, he says he's watching a chapter mobilize as of an hour ago. Roy, what did you do tonight? Roy looked at the night sky above the rest stop. I poked a hornet's nest, he said. And now there are 50 hornets on their way, Garrett said. Maybe more. I've got a town of 4,200 people who are going to wake up tomorrow to an occupation. I've got a girl named Amy Doyle in a house on the north side with her mother and her little brother and no idea what's coming. Roy, whatever you were trying to do, it's done. Stand down and let me handle this. Roy stood in the cold of the rest stop parking lot with the phone in his hand and looked at the mountains he couldn't see in the dark but knew were there. One more day, he said. Roy, give me until tomorrow afternoon. If I haven't resolved this by then, I will stand down completely and turn over everything I have to the federal authorities. You don't have anything the federal authorities would want. Roy thought about the USB drive in the top drawer of his office desk. Garrett, he said, you might be surprised. A pause. One day, Garrett said, and Roy, if this goes sideways, if anyone gets hurt, anyone including one of those bikers. I know, Roy said. He ended the call. He looked at Hank. He looked at Cal. Neither of them spoke. The night was very cold and very quiet, and the mountains were invisible but enormous behind the dark. Roy thought about the plan he had made. He thought about what had just happened to it. He thought about 50 men on the highway heading toward a town of 4,200 people. He thought about Amy Doyle in a house on the north side. He thought about Tommy Doyle and his malformed heart and the red notebook with the number inside it. And he thought about what a man has left when every plan has failed and the only thing remaining is the truth. He looked at Hank. Tomorrow, Roy said, I go talk to him. To Danny, face to face, just the two of us. Hank looked at him for a long moment. That's not a plan, Hank said. That's a surrender. No, Roy said. He looked at the dark sky. It's a last resort, he said, but not a surrender. He got back in his truck. He sat in the silence. He thought about Frank Tesaro. He thought about a phone call that needed to happen. He thought about what it cost a man to tell the truth after 34 years of telling a different story. He thought about whether it was enough. He didn't know, but it was what was left. And sometimes in Roy Weston's experience, what was left was exactly what was needed. He started the engine. He drove back to Millhaven. Behind him in the dark, the mountains held their ground. Roy didn't sleep. He lay on top of the covers in his apartment above the shop with his boots still on and his hands folded behind his head, and he looked at the ceiling and he counted the things he knew. He knew that 50 men were on the highway. He knew that Amy Doyle was in a house on the north side of town with her mother and her brother, and no understanding of what was moving toward them in the dark. He knew that Lou Garrett was sitting in his office at the sheriff's station running numbers that didn't add up the way good lawmen in impossible situations always sit and run numbers that don't add up, because the alternative is to stop believing the numbers matter. He knew that a plan he had spent 48 hours building had produced exactly the opposite of what it was designed to produce. And he knew that the only remaining instrument he had was a phone call to a prison in Deer Lodge and a conversation between a father and a son that was 34 years overdue. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about Maggie. He thought about the specific quality of her judgment, the way she had always been able to locate the center of a problem while he was still mapping its edges. She had done it without appearing to try the way genuinely precise people do things with a casualness that looked like intuition and was actually something more disciplined than that. What would she say? He could almost hear it. She would say, "You already know what needs to happen, Roy. You've known since you read Frank's name on that search screen. The only question is whether you're going to get out of your own way long enough to let it happen." He stared at the ceiling. She was right. She was always right. He sat up, he picked up the satellite phone. He dialed Frank Tessaro's number at the prison. It was 2:30 in the morning. The overnight operator was not enthusiastic about connecting an inmate call at this hour, and Roy spent 4 minutes navigating the recorded system before a human voice appeared, and he explained with a patience he was not entirely feeling that this was urgent and he needed the call connected. The call connected at 2:47. Frank's voice came through groggy and alarmed in the way of a man pulled from institutional sleep by a phone call that arrives at a time when phone calls only mean emergencies. Roy, Frank said. What happened? Roy told him. He told him about the flares in the note and the operation that had worked exactly as planned and produced entirely the wrong result. He told him about Garrett's call and the motorcycles on the highway. He told him about 50 men converging on a town of 4,200 people. He told him about Amy Doyle. He told him about Tommy. He told Frank the number in the red notebook, the one Amy counted every Thursday, the one that represented the distance between where things were and where they needed to be for a 10-year-old boy to get the surgery that would let him grow up. Frank was quiet through all of it. When Roy finished, the silence on the line stretched long enough that Roy checked the connection twice. Then Frank said, "What do you need from me?" Roy said, "I need you to call your son." Another silence. "I need you to tell him the truth." Roy said, "All of it. Who you are, why you left, why you lied about it. Every part of it that you've been carrying for 34 years. You give him that. Tonight." Frank said, "And you think that changes what's happening?" Roy said, "I think it's the only thing that has a chance of changing what's happening. Because everything else I've tried has made it worse. Because the man who ordered 50 people onto a highway is a man who has been living on a foundation of lies since before he could walk, and foundations built on lies crack. Frank, they always crack, but sometimes all it takes is one person telling the truth to start the process." Frank was quiet for a long time. Roy let him be quiet. This was not a moment to fill with more words. It was a moment to let a man sit with the weight of what he had avoided for 3 decades and decide finally what to do with it. Frank said, "What if he doesn't listen?" Roy said, "He might not. But he'll hear it, and hearing it is different from listening. What you say tonight he'll carry with him for the rest of his life, whether he wants to or not. You can't unring that bell, Frank, which means you have to make sure what you're ringing is true." Another long pause. Frank said, "I abandoned him, Roy. I was 20 years old and I was scared, and I ran, and I built my entire military career on the momentum of running away from my own son. Everything I did, every deployment, every commendation, every moment I spent proving myself, I was proving it to that boy, and he didn't even know I was his father." Roy said, "I know." Frank said, "And then I came back and I couldn't say it. I couldn't say I'm your father because saying it meant accounting for all of it, all the years, all the absence. I thought if I said it, the weight of it would just—" He stopped. Roy waited. Frank said, "What do I say to him?" Roy said, "The truth. Start there and go forward. Don't explain. Don't justify. Don't make it about you. You tell him who you are, and you tell him you're sorry, and you tell him you've been sorry every day for 34 years, and you're sorry you weren't brave enough to say it sooner. And then you stop talking, and you let him respond." Frank breathed out slowly. Roy said, "You saved my life in Fallujah, Frank." Frank said, "No. You saved mine." Roy said, "You did something I needed you to do that day. You kept fighting past empty. You were in an impossible situation with no ammunition, and you kept pulling a trigger that only clicked because stopping wasn't something your body knew how to do. That's not training. That's character. Whatever came after, whatever you did with the years I helped you get, that character is still in you. Use it tonight." Silence. Then Frank said, "Right, just those 2 words." Roy said, "Call him now. It's late, but call him now. Don't wait for morning." "Right," Frank said again. Roy ended the call. He set the satellite phone on the nightstand. He looked at the ceiling, He thought about what Frank Tessaro was doing at this moment, sitting on the edge of an institutional mattress in a correctional facility outside Deer Lodge, holding a phone that he was about to use to dismantle the only version of himself his son had ever known. He thought about what it cost a man to do that. He thought about what it was worth. He was at the shop before 5. He made coffee and he made dough, and he put the radio on low and he waited. Hank arrived at 6 with Cal behind him. Roy poured coffee without being asked. They sat around the prep table, 3 old men in the early morning light, and they didn't talk much because there wasn't much to say that the situation hadn't already said for them. At 7:15, Roy's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He read it. He set the phone down. He looked at Hank. Then he picked the phone back up and read the text again to be certain he had read it correctly the first time. This is Danny. I need to talk to you. Roy Weston. I know you're the one from last night. My father called me. I need to talk to you. Tell me where. Hank reading Roy's face. What is it? Roy showed him the screen. Hank read it. He looked up. Cal read it over Hank's shoulder. Roy picked up the phone. He typed grain elevator on Highway 12. Noon today. 2 men each. No weapons. He sent it. He set the phone face down on the prep table. He picked up his coffee. Nobody spoke for about 30 seconds. Then Hank said, he could be setting you up. Roy said he could be. Hank said, if he's setting you up, you walk into that grain elevator with 2 people and you meet 50. Roy said, then we'd better make sure Cal is in position before noon. Cal said, I'll need 2 hours, 1 to find the position, 1 to settle. Roy said, you've got 5. Cal nodded. Roy looked at the prep table, at the map still spread there from 2 nights ago, at the mark he had made on it to indicate the Steel Reaper's property, at the 6 miles of county road between that mark and where he was sitting. He thought about what Frank's phone call might have done. He thought about a man sitting in the dark after a call like that, holding information that rewrites everything he thought he knew about his own history. He thought about what that did to a person. He had seen it before, not in this context, but he had seen the moment when a person's fundamental understanding of their own story changes, and he knew it was not a gentle moment. It was not the kind of moment that leaves you soft and open and receptive to reason. It was the kind of moment that left you raw. The question was what Danny Tesoro did when he was raw. Roy didn't know the answer, but he knew that the text on his phone was not the message of a man who had decided to end this with violence. A man who had decided to end this with violence did not send texts asking to talk. He just came. Roy picked up his phone one more time. He dialed Patricia Doyle. She answered on the second ring. Mrs. Doyle, he said, I need you to take Amy and Tommy and go to your sister's house in Billings today. A pause. What's happening? Nothing is going to happen, Roy said. I am going to make sure of that. But I need you out of Millhaven today. Can you do that? Patricia said. You're scaring me, Mr. Weston. Roy said, good. Be scared enough to go. She said she would go. He said, thank you. He ended the call. He looked at Hank and Cal. Let's go over this properly, he said. They went over it properly. The grain elevator on Highway 12 had been abandoned since 1998. It was a substantial structure, even in its decrepitude, concrete silos reaching 40 feet into the Montana sky, rust-streaked and cracked along the seams, but still standing with the particular stubbornness of things built in an era when permanence was still a design goal. The access road leading to it was unmarked. The surrounding land was flat and open on the north and west sides, with a shallow rise to the south where a stand of cottonwoods had established themselves along a dry creek bed. Cal left at 7 in the morning. He found his position in the cottonwoods on the south rise, a spot that gave him clear sight lines to the main elevator building and the access road in the open ground in front of it. 800 yards. He ranged it twice and adjusted his scope and settled in with the patience that was perhaps the most genuinely remarkable thing about him, and the patience that had once allowed him to remain motionless in a hide for 31 hours waiting for a window that lasted 4 seconds. Hank drove a loop of the surrounding roads and confirmed the property was empty. At 10:30, Roy and Hank drove to the elevator. They parked on the west side of the main building and got out. The morning was cold and still. Roy stood in front of the building and looked at the access road, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was not nothing. It was the specific kind of cleared mental space that a man learns to create before doing something that requires all of him. At 11:50, Roy heard motorcycles. Not many. 2, maybe 3. They came down the access road slowly, not with the throttled aggression of a group making a statement, but with the cautious pace of someone who is uncertain about what they're arriving into. 3 bikes. Danny Tesoro on the first one. A man Roy recognized from the surveillance photographs as Ray Dog on the second, heavyset and dark-haired and wearing an expression of comprehensive displeasure at being somewhere he didn't want to be. And on the third bike, Henderson. Roy had been building a picture of Henderson for 2 days through Hank and Cal's surveillance reports and through the radio traffic he'd monitored on the stolen handset. What the picture had assembled was a man who was not the nominal leader of the Steel Reapers, but was in every operational sense the organization's actual center of gravity. Henderson was 41 years old. He had never been arrested, which in Roy's experience meant either that he was lucky or that he was careful, and luck didn't usually run for 15 years without intervention. Henderson was careful. He was the one who had designed the security rotation. He was the one who managed the financial relationships, the shell companies, the Escalade visits, the kickback to Webb. He was the one Roy had come to understand who had built the Steel Reapers from a local nuisance into a regional criminal enterprise. Danny Tesaro was the face. Henderson was the machine behind it. The three bikes stopped. Engines cut. Danny got off his bike and walked toward Roy with the particular gait of a man who is trying to look unhurried and is not entirely succeeding. He was taller up close than he had seemed in the parking lot 2 days ago, with a physical presence that Roy acknowledged without being affected by it. Danny stopped 10 feet away. He looked at Roy. He looked at Hank. He looked at the flat, open ground around them, the same way he had looked at the ridgeline outside his clubhouse 3 days ago and found nothing, and Roy watched him register that finding nothing was not the same as nothing being there. "Roy Weston," Danny said. Roy said, "Danny." A pause. "My father called me last night," Danny said. Roy said nothing. "He said a lot of things," Danny said. He was quiet for a moment. "He said things I've been waiting 34 years to hear, and I didn't know I was waiting for them until they arrived." He stopped again. Roy watched him working through something internal, the way you watch a mechanical process through a window visible, but out of reach. He said, "You saved his life." Roy said, "I did what anyone in my position would have done." Danny looked at him directly. He said, "No, that's not what he said. He said you disobeyed a direct order to do it. He said you ran across open ground under fire to reach him. He said the official report called it a mission failure because you went off protocol and the primary objective escaped. He said you took a formal reprimand for it." Roy said the kid was going to die. Danny said he was going to die and you ran across open ground anyway. "That's what he said." Roy waited. Danny said he also said other things. He looked down at the ground for a moment. "He said he's my father." Roy said, "I know." Danny looked up. His eyes were dark, the particular dark of someone who has not slept with a quality in them that Roy recognized from other faces in other circumstances, the quality of a person who has had their understanding of themselves fundamentally reorganized and is still trying to find the new orientation. "He said he's been my father for 34 years, and I didn't know it," Danny said. "I thought he was dead. He let me think he was dead for the first 23 years of my life, and then he found me and told me he was my brother. He said he was too ashamed to tell the truth." Roy said he was. Danny said that's supposed to mean something. That he was ashamed, Roy said, "No, it's just the truth. He was ashamed and he told you a lie he thought was kinder than the alternative, and it wasn't kinder, it was just easier for him. That's on him, not you." Danny looked at him. He said, "Why are you telling me this?" "You don't know me," Roy said, "because a girl I care about has a brother who needs surgery, and because you're in the middle of something that's going to end badly for everyone if we don't stop it now. And because your father asked me to save you the way I saved him." Danny said he told me that too. Roy said he did. Danny said, "And you think you can?" Roy said, "I think you came here instead of sending 50 men to deliver a message. That tells me something." A silence settled over the flat ground in front of the grain elevator. The cottonwoods moved slightly in the cold wind. Somewhere in those trees at 800 yards, Cal Briggs was watching this through his scope with the patience of a man for whom time was a manageable variable. Danny said, "I built everything I have on what he told me I was. He said we were brothers who had nobody else. He said family was what you made it when blood left you behind. He said everything I built with the Reapers was what real loyalty looked like. And now," he stopped. "Now it turns out," Danny said, "that the man who taught me what loyalty looked like was lying to me about who he was from the day he found me." Roy said, "Yes." Danny said, "So what does that make everything I built?" Roy said. "It makes it something you can walk away from." Danny looked at him sharply. Roy said, "The story you were given was a lie. That means the conclusions you drew from it don't have to be permanent. You built something on a foundation that wasn't true. That's not your fault. But it is your responsibility now because now you know." Danny said, "I have 22 people who depend on the organization." Roy said, "They'll find other ways to be angry at the world. People like that always do. You're not responsible for their anger." Danny said Henderson. He said the name differently from how he'd said the other things. Carefully. The way you say the name of something you are trying to assess before you commit to a position on it. Roy said, "What about him?" Danny said. "He won't let this go." Roy looked at him. He said, "I know." Behind Danny, Henderson had not moved from beside his motorcycle. He had his arms crossed and his weight distributed in the casual way of a man who is pretending to be relaxed. But Roy had been reading body language in high-stakes environments since before Danny Tesaro was born, and what he read in Henderson was not relaxation. It was calculation. The specific patient calculation of a man waiting for a moment. Roy said, "Danny, "Step to your left." Danny looked at him. He said, what Roy said, "Step to your left." Now, Danny heard something in Roy's voice that made him move before he understood why. He stepped left. Henderson had the gun out from behind his back before Danny finished the step. It was a compact, semi-automatic, the kind of weapon designed to be carried concealed, and Henderson had it up and aimed at the space where the back of Danny's head had been 2 seconds ago. He was aiming at Danny, not at Roy, not at Hank, at Danny. Roy heard it in his ear before he heard the shot. Cal's voice completely level, taking the shot. The rifle crack came from the cottonwoods on the south rise. It crossed 800 yards in slightly less than a second. It took Henderson in the right shoulder. The impact spun him backward. He hit the side of his motorcycle and went down hard, the pistol skittering across the gravel. He did not get up. He was alive, conscious, making sounds that indicated a significant amount of pain, but he was on the ground and the pistol was 5 feet from his hand and he was not getting up. The sound of the shot rolled out across the flat land and came back as an echo, and then there was silence. Danny stood absolutely still. He was looking at Henderson on the ground. He was looking at the pistol on the gravel. He was looking at where he had been standing 2 seconds ago and where the bullet would have gone if he hadn't moved. Ray Dog had both hands up before Roy even looked in his direction. He had them up and his eyes forward, in the expression of a man who has just performed a rapid cost-benefit analysis and arrived at a clear conclusion. Roy walked to Henderson's pistol. He picked it up. He looked at Henderson. Henderson looked back at him from the ground with the particular expression of a man who has spent 15 years being untouchable and has just discovered that untouchable was a conditional status. Roy said nothing to him. He looked at Danny. Danny was still looking at the place where he had been standing. Roy said he was going to kill you. Danny said nothing. Roy said, not me, not Hank, not the organization's enemies. You. The man you built the Reapers with was going to put a bullet in you to keep his organization intact. Danny turned and looked at Henderson on the ground. Henderson said nothing. Danny said, how long? Roy said, I don't know how long he's been managing you, but a man who has a gun behind his back at a meeting that was supposed to be 2 men each. No weapons came here planning to use it. That's not a decision you make on the spot. Danny looked at Henderson for a long moment. Then he looked at Roy. He said, I need to make some calls. Roy said, you have a decision to make first. Danny said, I know what decision I have to make. He said it quietly and without drama, the way people say things that are true and that they have already accepted the weight of. He took out his phone. He dialed a number. Roy listened. Danny said into the phone, call it off, all of it. Tell everyone to turn around. We're done here. A voice on the other end, unintelligible. Danny said, I said we're done. Don't ask me again. Just do it. He ended the call. He stood with the phone in his hand. Roy heard it somewhere on the highway, 50 men being turned back. The particular momentum of something large and violent reversing direction. He heard it in the quality of the air. Sheriff Garrett's cruiser came down the access road 3 minutes later. Garrett got out and looked at Henderson on the ground and looked at Roy and looked at the gun in Roy's hand and let the silence describe itself. Roy handed him Henderson's pistol. He said, attempted murder. You'll find other things when you pull his records. He's been running the financial operation for the Reapers for 15 years. All of it. I've been building the file. Garrett said, what file? Roy reached into his jacket and took out a USB drive. He held it out. Garrett looked at it. Roy said, everything. The shell companies, also the web connection. The kickback to the mayor. The compromised judge. 2 days of documented transactions and recorded communications. It's thorough, Garrett said. Where did you get this? Roy said, I collected what was already there. You just couldn't get to it from where you were standing. Garrett took the USB drive. He looked at it in his hand. He looked at Roy. He said, you had this the whole time. Roy said, I had pieces of it. I put them together over 48 hours. The surveillance that was supposed to just be tactical intelligence turned into something else when I started seeing the patterns. Garrett said, you could have given this to me 2 days ago. Roy said, 2 days ago, you didn't have Henderson in cuffs and the organization dismantled. You had a file and a system designed to make that file disappear before it reached a courtroom. Garrett looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Henderson. He said, get up. Henderson looked at his shoulder. Garrett said, I know it hurts. Get up. Henderson got up. Garrett put him in the cruiser. He came back to Roy. He said, the federal investigation is going to take time. Roy said, I know. He said, Webb's lawyers are going to fight everything. Roy said, I know that too. Garrett said, but with what's on that drive, if it's what you say it is, Roy said it is. Garrett nodded slowly. He looked at Danny Tesoro, who was standing by his motorcycle with his phone still in his hand, and the particular stillness of a man who is standing in the aftermath of a fundamental reorganization of his life. Roy Garrett said quietly. What happens to him? Roy said. That's up to him. Garrett looked at Danny for another moment. Then he got in his cruiser. He drove away. Roy walked to where Danny was standing. Danny said, he was going to kill me. Roy said, yes. Danny said, the man I trusted most. Roy said, yes. Danny said, because I was going to choose differently. Roy said, people who have built their power on someone else's loyalty tend to react badly when that loyalty finds a different direction. Danny looked at Roy. He said, what do I do now? Roy said, what do you want to do? A long silence. Danny looked at the grain elevator, at the rust-streaked silos, at the flat land around them and the mountains in the distance and the October sky above all of it. He said, I know how to fix engines, motorcycles mostly, cars too. It's the only thing I've ever been good at that wasn't. He stopped. That wasn't what I had to be good at, he said. Roy said, then that's where you start. Danny said, it's not enough. Roy said, it's what you have. It's always enough if it's what you have and you use it honestly. Danny was quiet. Then he said the girl, the one who came to the clubhouse, the delivery girl. Roy said Amy. Danny said I went to see her this morning. Roy looked at him. Danny said, before I texted you, I went to her house. Roy said, I know. Danny said she didn't slam the door in my face. Roy said no. Danny said she should have. Roy said probably, but that's who she is. Danny looked at Roy. He said I gave her money for her brother. Roy said I know that too. Danny said it's not enough. Roy said it's not supposed to be enough. It's not supposed to fix it. It's just the first thing. Danny said, what's the second thing? Roy said. Leaving, a pause. Danny said, yeah. Roy said, and after leaving, being different somewhere else. Every day. Not because anyone is watching, and not because it makes a good story, just because it's the thing you chose. Danny looked at the ground. He said, my father called me from prison to tell me the truth. After 34 years, he called me from prison. Roy said, yes. Danny said, is that supposed to mean something? Roy said, it means he did the hardest thing he knew how to do when it was too late to matter in most of the ways that count, and he did it anyway. Danny said, that's not very inspiring. Roy almost smiled. He said, no, but it's honest, and honest is where things start. Danny looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded once. The nod of a man who has received information that he is going to carry for a long time and is acknowledging it rather than accepting it, because acceptance takes longer than a moment, but acknowledgement is something you can do right now in a parking lot outside an abandoned grain elevator on a cold October morning in Montana. He walked back to his motorcycle. He started the engine. He drove away down the access road without looking back. Ray Dog, still with his hands in an ambiguous position, watched Danny go. Then he looked at Roy. He said, am I free to leave, Roy? Said, I'm not the one keeping you. Ray Dog got on his motorcycle and left. Hank walked up beside Roy. They watched the bikes go down the access road and turn onto the highway and disappear. Hank said, that's it, Roy said. That's it. Hank said, no final confrontation. No big speech. Roy said, I gave the speech. He heard it. Hank said, how do you know? Roy said, because he came here when he didn't have to. Because he moved when I told him to move without knowing why. Because he made the call. Hank looked at the empty access road. He said, you think it sticks? Roy said, I think he'll try. Whether it sticks depends on him. That part was never mine to control. Cal walked up from the South Rise rifle slung across his back, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who has just completed a task to his own satisfaction. He stopped beside them. He looked at the place where Henderson had been on the ground. He said, shoulder. Roy said, clean. Cal said, he'll have full use of it in 4 months. Roy said, good. Cal said, I've had cleaner shots. Roy said, you've also had easier ones. Cal nodded. They stood together for a moment in the cold morning air. 3 old men in a parking lot outside an abandoned grain elevator with the mountains white in the distance and the sky very blue and very wide above everything. Hank said, so. Pizza Roy looked at him. Hank said, I drove 160 miles in the dark. I have been awake for an extremely inadvisable number of hours. I have stood in the cold in a hunting blind for most of 2 days. And I have been existing on gas station coffee and leftover pizza for 72 hours. I would like Roy a fresh pizza, made by the man who actually knows how to make one. Today. Please. Roy looked at him for a moment. He said, yeah. All right. They drove back to Millhaven. Roy reopened the shop at 4 in the afternoon. He put a new sign in the window. He had taken down the clothes for family emergency sign and replaced it with the regular hours card, and the normalcy of that small action felt like something larger than it was. The return of ordinary things after extraordinary circumstances, the way life reassembles itself around what just happened and just keeps going. He made dough, he prepped sauce, he grated cheese, he turned on the radio. Merle Haggard. He left it. At 5 o'clock, Amy Doyle walked through the door. She was not supposed to be in Billings. Roy looked at her. She said, "My mother and Tommy left. I stayed." Roy said, "Amy." She said, "I heard what happened. Garrett called my mother. She called me." Roy looked at her. At the fading bruise on the left side of her face yellowed now, the edges soft, the body's patient work of repair. She said, "He came to the house this morning." Roy said, "I know." She said, "Before you met him at the elevator." Roy said, "I know." She said, "He apologized." Roy said, "Yes." She said, "He didn't make excuses. He didn't explain. He just said he was sorry and he gave me the envelope and he left." Roy looked at her. She said, "Is that real?" "Can that be real?" Roy said. "I think he meant it. Whether it lasts is up to him. But in that moment, I think he meant it." Amy stood in the kitchen for a moment. She looked at the photograph of Maggie on the wall. She said, "The money he gave me, $5,000. Roy said, "I saw." She said, "That's 47,615 now." Roy said, "I know." She looked at him. She said, "You know," Roy opened the drawer under the register. He took out the plain envelope. He set it on the counter. Amy looked at it. She looked at Roy. He said, "Every Thursday, 6 months." She picked up the envelope. She opened it. She looked at the money inside. She was very still for a moment. Then she set the envelope down on the counter, and she stood with her hands flat on the stainless steel surface, and she looked at them, and she did not say anything for a long time. Roy went back to the dough. He gave her the time. After a while, she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because it wasn't about telling you. It was about the number in your notebook." She said, "Roy." He looked up. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You don't have to thank me for that." She said, "I know. I'm doing it anyway." She tied on her apron. She went to work. They worked the dinner service together in the familiar rhythm of the shop, the particular choreography of two people who have shared this kitchen long enough that their movements have become coordinated without effort, each of them occupying the space the other isn't using, the way things settle when they've been in proximity long enough. At 6:30, Hank and Cal came in. Roy put out a table in the corner and made them a pizza without being asked, pepperoni and sausage on one half and plain cheese on the other half, because Cal had not changed his order in 20 years and Roy had not needed to ask. They ate. Nobody talked much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said, and in the particular economy of communication that these three men had arrived at over 2 decades, the absence of words said quite a lot. At 7:15, Sheriff Garrett came in. Off duty, out of uniform. He stood at the counter for a moment, and Roy poured him a coffee, and he sat on the stool at the end of the counter, and he wrapped both hands around the mug. He said, "The USB drive is solid." Roy said, "I know." He said, "I forwarded it to the FBI field office in Helena. They're interested." Roy said, "Good." He said, "Webb is going to lawyer up the moment the first call is made." Roy said, "He will, but his lawyers are going to have a harder time than usual." Garrett said, "You did more damage to his structure in 48 hours than 15 years of working through proper channels did." Roy said, "I had access to different methods." Garrett looked at him over the coffee mug. He said, "Henderson is going to be looking at a significant sentence. Attempted murder of a member of his own organization is not a sympathetic charge." Roy said, "No." Garrett said, "The DA, who's been soft on the Reapers, is going to be looking at a different kind of trouble once the Webb connection is established. Federal investigators don't have the same local considerations." Roy said, "That's the idea." Garrett wrapped his hands tighter around the mug. He said, "Roy." Roy looked at him. Garrett said, "What you did these past 3 days. I'm not going to pretend I understand all of it or approve of all of it." Roy said, "I know." Garrett said, "But that girl didn't have to be afraid tonight. And that matters. It matters to me." Roy looked at him. He said, "It mattered to me too, Lou." Garrett nodded. He drank his coffee. He left a 10 on the counter for a cup that cost $2.50. Roy left it there. 6 months later. Tommy Doyle's surgery was performed at the Mayo Clinic on a Tuesday morning in April. It lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. The surgeon came out afterward and described the outcome with the particular understated satisfaction of someone who has done something difficult well and finds the vocabulary of celebration insufficient to the reality of the work. He said the valve replacement was successful. He'll be in recovery for 24 hours. You should be able to see him this evening. Patricia Doyle sat down in the waiting room chair and covered her face with her hands and didn't make any sound. Amy stood beside her with her hand on her mother's shoulder and looked at the wall across the room with the expression of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and is only now beginning to understand what it will feel like to set it down. Roy was not at the hospital. He was in Millhaven. He had closed the shop for the day and sat in the kitchen alone and drank his coffee and looked at the photograph of Maggie on the wall. He thought about what she would have made of all this. He thought he could hear her. She would have said, "You did good, Roy." Not perfectly, but good. He would have said, "I'm not sure good covers it." She would have said, "It never does." That's not what good means. Good means you showed up. You did the thing when it needed doing. You made the place safe when it wasn't. He would have said, "It cost more than I planned." She would have said, "It always does." That's what honesty about cost looks like. You pay it and you're still here. He sat with that for a while. In the months that followed, the federal investigation moved at the pace that federal investigations move, which is slow and methodical and accompanied by a great deal of paperwork and not nearly enough visible progress for the people who are waiting on it. But it moved. Councilman Webb resigned from the city council in March, citing health reasons that were not entirely unconvincing, given the quality of the legal trouble bearing down on him from multiple directions. The mayor announced he would not seek re-election. The DA's office under new management, following the sudden departure of the incumbent, for reasons that were described publicly as personal, began reviewing cases that had been deprioritized over the preceding several years. Henderson was charged with attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, drug trafficking, and 11 counts of related financial crimes. His bail was set at a number that his lawyers described as excessive and that everyone else described as reasonable given the circumstances. The Steel Reapers ceased to exist as an operational organization within 60 days of the grain elevator. The individual members dispersed to other places and other situations the way people do when the structure they've been operating inside collapses and there is nothing left to be a member of. Danny Tesoro opened a motorcycle repair shop in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He called it Tesoros. He was good at the work. He had always been good at the work. The difference now was that the work was the thing itself and not a cover for something else. And that difference, which sounds small, changes everything about how a day feels when you're living it. He called Frank twice in the first month. Short calls, the calls of two people learning a new language with each other, stumbling over grammar, getting the pronunciation wrong, trying again. By the third month, the calls were longer. By the sixth month, they were something like honest, not healed, honest. The distinction matters, and both of them were beginning to understand it. Amy Doyle received her acceptance letter from the medical school at the University of Washington on a Thursday morning. She brought it to the shop. She held it out to Roy without saying anything. He read it. He handed it back. He said, "Pediatric cardiology." She said kids like Tommy shouldn't have to be afraid of the thing inside their own chest. Roy looked at her. He said, "No, they shouldn't." She folded the letter carefully along its original creases. She put it in her coat pocket. The coat still had the patch on the elbow. The stitching was still the almost right shade of blue. She could afford a new coat now. She hadn't replaced it. Roy thought he understood why. On the first Friday in December, Hank and Cal came back. They came without being asked. Hank knocked on the shop door at 5 in the afternoon, and Roy opened it, and Hank said, "We thought we'd come for the weekend." And Roy said, "I'll make a pizza." And they all understood that this was going to happen again, that it had become a thing, a regular thing, the kind of regular thing that builds itself between people who have been through something together and found that the something changed the calibration of what they want from a Friday evening. They ate. They didn't talk much. Hank drank his coffee. Cal ate his plain cheese pizza with the focused appreciation of a man who has been looking forward to it since Wednesday. Roy watched the shop from behind the counter. Families in the booths. The Hendersons from down the block. The old couple who had been coming in every Thursday for 8 years, still ordering the same veggie pizza, extra mushrooms, light on the sauce, still holding hands while they ate. A table of high school kids sharing a pepperoni and arguing about something with the pleasant, low-stakes intensity of people who have not yet had to argue about anything that truly matters. The door chimed. Roy looked up. Tommy Doyle ran in. He was wearing a winter coat 2 sizes too large that was clearly a recent acquisition, and he had snow on his shoulders from the first real snow of December, and his cheeks were red and his eyes were bright with the specific brightness of a 10-year-old boy who has been told he can have pizza and is treating this as an event of appropriate significance. Behind him, Amy. She was smiling. Not the smile she deployed at work, the one that was genuine, but also effortful. The smile of someone who has decided to put brightness into the room because the room needs it. This was a different smile. The smile of a person who is not working at it. The smile of someone who has set something down. Tommy ran to the counter. He put both hands on it and looked up at Roy. He said, "Mr. Weston, my sister says you're a hero." Roy came around from behind the counter. He crouched down to the boy's level. Tommy was small for 10, the way children who have had significant medical procedures sometimes are the body having spent its energy on survival rather than growth. But he was healthy now. You could see it in the color of him, in the way he moved, in the uncomplicated brightness in his eyes. He had a scar on his chest under his shirt. Roy knew it was there. He thought it was something the boy would carry his whole life and come to understand differently at different ages, as a mark of what had been done for him, as a reminder of what he had survived, as evidence of the distance between where things were and where they needed to be, and the people who had worked to close that distance. Roy looked at Tommy. He said, "I'm not a hero, kid. I'm just the guy who makes the pizza." Tommy considered this with the seriousness of a 10-year reading a claim he suspects may not be entirely accurate. He looked at Roy's hands, the scars, the white lines across the knuckles, the long, pale mark along the left wrist. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked back up. He said, "Cool. Can I have a slice?" Roy looked at him. Something moved in Roy Weston's chest, in the place where all the things he had carried for a long time lived. The absence and the grief and the 15 years of keeping a promise to a woman who laughed with her whole face and who had asked him to make a place where people felt safe. The thing that moved was not grief. It was something on the other side of grief. The side you reach if you keep going. He said, "Yeah, you can have a slice. Extra cheese." "On the house," Tommy grinned. He went to find a booth. Amy stood at the counter. She looked at Roy. He looked at her. Nothing needed to be said. She went to find her brother. Roy stood behind the counter in the shop he had built to keep a promise, and he looked at the families in the booths and the old couple holding hands, and Hank and Cal in the corner eating pizza in comfortable silence, and the photograph of Maggie on the wall where she was always laughing, and he thought about the question he had asked himself in the rain outside the Steel Reapers parking lot 48 hours that felt like a different life. What was he fighting for? He thought he had figured it out. Not in the parking lot, not at the grain elevator, not in any single moment that could be pointed to and named, but across all of it, across the accumulated weight of all of it. He was fighting for this room, these people, this ordinary, unremarkable, completely irreplaceable collection of human beings eating pizza on a Friday night in a small Montana town, while the first snow of December fell outside and the mountains held their ground in the dark. Maggie had known it before he did. She had always known it. He looked at her photograph. She was laughing. She was always laughing. He thought, "I know Maggie. I finally know." Outside, the snow fell on Millhaven. It fell on 3 blocks of brick buildings and a water tower and a grain elevator that had been standing empty since 1998 and showed no signs of stopping. It fell on the county road that ran 6 miles northeast to a property that had gone quiet. It fell on the mountains and the high passes and the long flat land between them. The shop was warm. The lights were on. People came and went. And Roy Weston, 68 years old, former Navy SEAL, senior chief widower, pizza maker, the man who had stood in the rain outside the worst address in 3 counties and not backed up a single step, stood behind his counter and watched his customers eat. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had been the whole time. He just needed 48 hours to remember it.